She was 16 years old, alone on a mountain road in a blizzard, and she was the only person alive who knew what was on that card. By the time the sun came up, a county sergeant would be in handcuffs, a deputy would be under arrest, and 500 motorcycles would be parked outside a hospital, in the dark, silent, waiting for a homeless boy no one had ever bothered to look at twice. This is what happened between midnight and morning on Ridgecrest Pass. The first thing you see is her hands. They are pressing down on a chest that isn't moving. Both palms locked together, arms straight, elbows rigid, a 16-year-old girl with a gash across her left shoulder blade, doing compressions on a 17-year-old boy who is laid out cold on a concrete floor. Her face is tight, her jaw is set, her riding jacket is torn at the collar, and a strip of fabric she cut from the lining is wrapped around her midsection, already soaking through with something dark. The only light in the room comes from a small fire burning in a metal barrel near the center of the space, and the shadows it throws across the walls look like something alive and deliberate. She doesn't stop pressing. She counts under her breath, each number forced through clenched teeth. Each compression costs her something she cannot afford to spend. Then the boy coughs, one hard, wet jerk of the whole body. His eyes open and he looks up at her with the blank confusion of someone who has just returned from somewhere far away, and she sits back on her heels and exhales a breath that had been waiting a long time to leave. She says nothing. She just nods once, the way someone nods when a thing they already decided would happen finally does. That image holds for 3 seconds. Then it cuts. An hour and 40 minutes earlier. The snow was just starting when Sawyer Merritt pulled out of the parking structure on Federal Boulevard. Denver was still lit up behind her all-glass and amber streetlights, the kind of city glow that makes the sky look like the inside of a furnace. She hit the on-ramp heading south and felt the tires find the highway with that low, familiar hum, and she turned the heat up 2 notches and thought about nothing in particular. She was 16 years old, and she drove a mountain pass alone at midnight the way other girls her age drove to the mall. Not because she was reckless, because Dax Merritt had spent a decade making sure she understood the difference between fear and danger. Fear was weather. Danger was a decision you let someone else make for you. The distinction mattered up here. Ridgecrest Pass in January was not a road that forgave distraction. It climbed through the San Isabel in long, switchbacking curves that could run 400 feet above a ravine with nothing between you and the drop but a guardrail that hadn't been replaced since the 90s. In summer, it was the kind of road that made people pull over just to take photographs. In a blizzard, it was the kind of road that appeared in accident reports as a location without needing any further explanation. But Sawyer knew it. She had learned it the way you learn a language when you grow up surrounded by it. She knew where the pavement buckled at the 3rd switchback. She knew the exact moment the shoulder disappeared at mile marker 11. She knew the wind would try to push the car sideways just past the old Briar Ridge water tower, and that you had to hold the wheel firmly and not fight it, just steer through and let the gust spend itself against the front quarter panel and wait for the road to come back to you on the other side. She knew all of it. The envelope in her bag she did not think about. Not because she was suppressing it, but because it was handled. The meeting with the lawyers in Denver had gone the way it was supposed to go. The documents had been reviewed and signed and witnessed by 2 people whose names would appear on the appropriate filings at the appropriate time. Now the drive home was just the drive home, and in the morning Dax would call the contact in Denver, and the process would move forward the way it needed to. Slow, careful, documented. That was how these things worked when you did them right. Flynn Decker had died for what was in that envelope. 2 years of his life collecting it. 8 months of her father carrying the weight of knowing what had happened to him on a road that looked a lot like this one. 8 months of Dax waking at 4 in the morning and sitting in the kitchen and drinking coffee he didn't want because sleeping through the 4 o'clock hour had become impossible. But that part was finished now. The drive home was just the drive home. She remembered the first time Dax had given her the patch. She was 13. He had taken it out of his vest pocket with the same hands that could lift an engine block without assistance, and he had held it out to her as though it weighed nothing, which it did, and as though it meant everything, which it did. The Iron Crest patch, a silver eagle on black felt. Her name was not on it. Names weren't the point. The point was something that didn't translate easily into words, but that every person who wore one understood in exactly the same way from the first moment they wore it to the last. He had said only one thing when he placed it in her hand. The patch means you're not alone. She had sewn it into the lining of her riding jacket 2 hours later, against the ribs over the heart, where it pressed against her when the jacket zipped. 3 years on, she still wore it there. She reached the base of the first long climb at 11:58 p.m. The snow had thickened in the past 20 minutes, changing from the large, slow flakes that meant a moderate storm to the fine, hard particles that meant something more serious was building from the northwest. She dropped to second gear without thinking about it and let the road come to her. There is a particular quality to mountain roads in heavy snow. The world gets small. Everything outside the cone of your headlights turns into a gray-white nothing, and the only things that are real are the road immediately ahead and the sound of your own engine and the sound of the wind working on every surface of the car all at once. For someone who doesn't know what they're doing, that smallness is terrifying. For someone who does, it's simply the set of conditions that need to be read and responded to one at a time without rushing. Sawyer was reading them. She was reading the road surface and the wind direction and the behavior of the snow against her headlights, doing all of it simultaneously and automatically the way you breathe when the lights appeared in her mirror. 2 headlights, high and wide, a truck she registered, moving fast. She moved right to give it room to pass. The headlights didn't pass. They closed the distance instead, filling her mirror until the inside of her car went bright with reflected light, and she had one clear moment of understanding. Not fear, understanding that this was intentional before the impact came. It struck the rear corner on the driver's side. Not a full collision, calculated. The precise kind of contact designed not to stop a vehicle, but to redirect it, to send it sideways faster than the driver could correct, to use speed and angle and physics to accomplish what a blunt force impact might not. She felt the rear end kick left, and she overcorrected in the half second before the front wheels lost the road's edge, and then there was no road at all. The car went down the embankment at an angle. Something hit the front end hard. The airbag fired, and she felt it against her face, flat and chemical smelling, and then the car was still. She sat in the silence that follows a crash, the profound stillness that comes right after violence. The engine had stalled. The hazard lights had activated automatically orange pulses through the cracked windshield. Snow was beginning to cover the hood. She did the inventory, the one Dax had taught her. Name what you know. Her left shoulder hurt. Her neck ached from the whip of impact. She could move everything that needed to move. The door beside her had buckled inward, but not completely. Her phone was in the cup holder to her right. She reached for it. That was when she heard the sound of boots in the snow above her, not one set. Two, she went still. 2 sets of boots moving without urgency down the embankment toward the passenger side of the car. She could see their shapes in the peripheral wash of the hazard lights. Large men, work jackets. She could not see faces. She could see that they were not running. They were not calling out to ask if she was hurt. They were not here to help. She understood this the same way she understood the road. Not through panic, through the specific clarity that arrives when the body decides there is no time left for confusion. She had perhaps 30 seconds. The phone was already in her hand. She checked signal. Nothing, just as she had expected. She had lost signal a mile back on the climb. But the phone's voice memo application was still open from when she had used it to record notes during the meeting in Denver, and her thumb found the record button before her mind had fully articulated the reason why. She didn't know what she was recording. She didn't know yet if it would matter. She pressed it anyway because she had been taught that when everything else was gone, the one thing you could always do was document. She dropped the phone between the seat and the center console face down. Keep it hidden. The passenger door opened. A hand reached in and found her bag. Pulled it out. She did not fight it. One against two, damaged shoulder, no signal, no help coming. Fighting it would accomplish nothing and cost her the clarity she needed to be spending on observation. She watched through half-closed eyes and memorized. The jacket on the nearer man, the heavy tread boots, steel-toed. The shape of the second man behind the first, slightly taller, standing back like someone watching a road rather than participating in what was happening below it. She heard the taller one say clearly enough to travel through the cracked glass in the wind, "Graves said get the drive and the girl. Don't leave witnesses." The nearer man reached for her door handle. In the 3 seconds before it opened, Sawyer reached down along the inside of the door panel to the place where her left foot rested and found the micro SD card she had transferred the data to before leaving the law office. The lawyers had kept the original drive. She always kept a backup because Dax had taught her that the thing you protect openly is never the thing that matters most. She found the seam of her right boot insole with her fingernail, pressed the card into the toe of the waterproof lining where the foam was thick enough to absorb the shape. Then the door opened and the man's hand closed on her jacket collar. She turned her face away and kept her eyes open and memorized what she could see in the hazard light. She heard a sound above her up on the road, a song or the wind changing direction or something else. The taller man said something short and urgent. The nearer one dropped her. Her shoulder hit the snow. She heard them go back up the embankment. A vehicle door opened and closed. Tires on packed snow moving away fast. She lay in the snow for 45 seconds. Then she rolled onto her good shoulder and got her knees under her. Name what you know. Mile marker 18 on Ridgecrest Pass. Phone still in the car, still recording. Bag gone. Patch gone, original flash drive in the lawyer's hands in Denver. Micro SD card in her boot. Temperature dropping, no phone signal, left shoulder compromised, and no vehicle coming in either direction. She needed to get up. She got up. She climbed back into the car and retrieved the phone from the console. The recording was still running. She ended it. The auto upload would need signal she didn't have yet, but the file existed now and it was hers. She tucked the phone inside her jacket against her body close to the patch, and she climbed the embankment on her good arm and reached the road and stood in the whiteout. She looked north. She looked south. She started walking south. She did not know yet that Colt Hadley was 60 yards behind her. He had been sheltering in the recessed doorway of an old concrete road survey box, the kind of utility structure built decades ago, and forgotten since using a piece of corrugated metal he had found to break the wind. He had been doing what he had spent the past 8 months learning to do on this pass. He had been waiting out the night. Colt Hadley was 17 years old. He had learned Ridgecrest Pass the way Sawyer had learned it, except the version he learned had nothing to do with headlights or timing or the behavior of a vehicle in mountain weather. His version was about where the wind came from and which sections of the road created natural windbreaks and how long you could stay still in a given temperature before still became the same thing as dangerous. He knew the road because it had been the only road available to him since October, when the Briar Ridge Group foster home had become a place he could no longer be in, and he had walked sections of it nearly every day looking for work at the highway maintenance depot 3 miles north. He had heard the crash. He stayed put for 30 seconds. Trouble on a mountain road at night had a way of becoming trouble that included you if you weren't careful, and Colt had learned to measure the shape of something before he stepped into it. Then he heard a sound beneath the wind. Not a cry exactly, the sound a person makes when they are trying not to make a sound. He ran. The snow erased distance the way it always did. One moment there was nothing ahead but white, and then there was a figure on the road upright but moving wrong. Left arm held tight against the body. Steps that were too deliberate for someone who was not hurt. He called out. She stopped. He came alongside her, and the hazard lights from the car below were still blinking orange through the embankment, and in their light he could see her face. She was looking at him the way you look at something you have not yet decided about. Clear-eyed. Assessing. He said, "You need to get off this road." She said, "I know." A short pause. "There are men in a truck. They went north. They'll come back around." He absorbed this without follow-up questions because the questions could wait and the road could not. "There's a county road services building," she said. 9 miles south, other side of the second ridge. He looked at her arm, at her lips. "I can walk," she said. He believed her. But her lips had gone from their natural color to something without warmth in it, and her hands were not shaking yet, which meant the cold had not fully arrived yet, which meant it was about to. And shaking not yet was worse than shaking now, because it meant the body was still spending reserves it didn't know it was running out of. "You'll walk with me," he said. They went. The first mile was nearly manageable. The road was still identifiable under the snow, and Sawyer talked as they moved, not to fill silence, but to communicate necessary things. She told him the building was the only guaranteed shelter on this stretch. She told him the men would expect her to stay near the crash or try to flag traffic on the main thruway. She told him to stay on the slope side of the road, not the drop side. He listened to all of it and adjusted accordingly. She was the compass. He was the engine. He understood this without it being said. It was simply the shape of what was needed, and he moved into it. By the second mile, the wind had turned. It was coming from the north-northwest now, across the open face of the pass with nothing to slow it, and it was carrying snow, fine and hard enough to find every gap in clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Colt felt his feet inside his boots go from cold to numb over about 3 minutes. He had made peace with numb feet some weeks back. Numb was manageable. Numb meant the boots were still doing their job well enough to matter. He felt Sawyer's pace change at the top of the second rise. Not a stumble. Something more subtle. A slight lag between what the body intended and what it executed, the way a machine sounds different in the moment before it changes gear. He moved her arm across his shoulders before she asked. She did not resist. He shifted her weight against him and kept moving, and she kept talking, which was how he knew she was still present. Not the specific words, but the fact of them. She described the road ahead. She told him about the building, about the gate, about which side of the structure had the best approach. She talked about the destination, the way someone talks about a place they have already arrived at in their mind and are simply walking their body toward. At the third mile, she went quiet. He did not push her. He talked instead. He said whatever came to him, not caring whether it was interesting or coherent, just offering the sound of another voice as something to follow. He talked about the mile markers he had memorized, about the diner in Briar Ridge with the breakfast burrito that should have been illegal in at least 2 jurisdictions, about the way the pass looked on clear days when you could see all the way to the next range and the sky was the specific blue that only happened at altitude after a cold front had moved through and cleaned everything. She didn't respond. But somewhere in the third mile, he felt her shoulder ease fractionally against him. By the 5th mile, the snow was past his knees in the drifted sections, and the road itself had become invisible. He was navigating by feel, by the slight downhill grade that confirmed he was still on the cut and not drifting toward the tree line, where the grade changed and the snow changed and the sounds changed in ways that would take time he didn't have to correct. He had a working understanding of what happened to people who drifted into the trees in conditions like this. He had no intention of testing it personally. He kept moving. At the 6th mile, she said, 2 men, at my window after the crash. I know. Boots, heavy tread. The nearer one had a logo on his jacket, too dark to read. Okay, a silence filled by wind. Then, they took my phone, but the recording when it was already running when they opened the door. He understood what she was telling him. Whatever she had captured was either lost with the phone or sitting on a server somewhere, and there was nothing either of them could do about it between here and mile 9 in the middle of a blizzard. Hold it for when it matters, he said. She said, name what you know. He looked at her. Something my father taught me, she said. When things go wrong, you name the facts you can confirm. It keeps the thinking clear. He thought about that. Then he said, I know we're on Ridgecrest Pass. I know you're still talking. I know there's a building 9 miles from where we started, and we've covered 6 of them. She nodded. Small motion. Like it cost something she was rationing. He kept moving. At the 8th mile, a set of headlights appeared through the snow behind them. Coming from the north. Coming fast. He pulled her off the road and down into the shallow ditch on the uphill side before she had time to ask why, pressing her against the snowbank, one arm around her shoulders, keeping her from sliding. The headlights swept across the road surface above them without slowing. A truck. Wide headlights spacing exactly what she had described. The vehicle passed and the sound of it moved south and faded. He waited. When it was gone, he looked down at the road. In the beam of his small headlamp, he could see the tire tracks pressed into the fresh snow directly over the tracks he and Sawyer had been leaving. The same vehicle, going the same direction. They knew the south route. They were covering it. He said nothing. He pulled Sawyer back up to the road and he moved faster, and she matched his pace without asking, because she had seen the same thing he had seen. The 9th mile arrived on a bent signpost. The wind had worked halfway loose from its post hole. He leaned close enough to read the number and felt something in his chest loosen by 1 degree. 1 mile left. He had been holding 9 miles as a fixed point in his mind for the past hour, and now 9 had become 1, and 1 was a number that felt like something a person could actually carry. He turned to tell her. Her head had dropped against his shoulder. Not gradually. She had been there, And then she was not there, and the weight of her shifted in a way that was different from exhaustion. And he caught her before she could take them both down his arm, tightening hard around her, and he lowered them both to the road surface, carefully keeping her above the snow. He said her name. Nothing. He said it again. Her lips were the color of ash. Her lashes had ice on them. He pressed his face close enough to feel her breath. It was there, barely. The kind of presence that was almost the same as absence. He pulled the glove off his right hand with his teeth and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Faint. And then between one heartbeat and the next, it simply was not there. He did not panic. Panic was weather. He had made his choice about panic the same way he made his choice about most things in advance as a policy, because policies didn't break down under pressure the way decisions made in the moment could. He tilted her chin back. He sealed his mouth over hers and gave her 2 slow breaths. He positioned both palms over her sternum and began compressions. Straight arms, full weight, the rhythm the shelter instructor had drilled until it became automatic. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The snow packed against his knees. The wind hit him from the front like something personal. He did not stop. At 20 compressions, he breathed for her again. Somewhere ahead, through the white-out headlights, appeared. Moving upward through the pass, multiple sets. Too many to count in the conditions. He watched them over the motion of his compressions and raised his arm and waved until his shoulder screamed, and the lights kept coming, but they did not slow. They swept past him one after another, the wind of the last vehicle slapping him across the face like a reprimand. He dropped his arm. He breathed for her again. He pressed both palms down and counted. Then she coughed. It was the worst sound he had ever heard, and simultaneously the best sound he had ever heard. Small and wet and ragged and unmistakably, stubbornly, defiantly alive. Her whole body moved with it, and he had her against his chest before the cough finished her face against his jacket, his arms around her because her temperature was still dropping, and the ground was still cold, and he was still 1 mile from the only shelter either of them had. He got to his feet. He did not know how. There were no reserves left to draw on. He had spent everything in the 8th mile, and whatever he was running on now was not a resource he could name. He moved anyway. He kept her weight against him, and he talked to her, not caring if she heard, saying whatever came. He told her the building was 1 mile. He told her the mile was made of steps, and steps were made of decisions, and the decision was just to take the next one. He told her she had kept moving through everything the night had thrown at her, and she did not get to stop now. He said it out loud without knowing he was saying it. She kept moving. He said it again. To the storm, maybe. To the road. To the specific hostile darkness of a Colorado mountain pass at 1 in the morning in January, which did not care about any of this, but was the only thing present enough to receive it. She kept moving. A dark rectangular shape materialized out of the blowing snow ahead. A fence line, a low metal building, letters above a gate that he read in the beam of his headlamp, Briar Ridge County Road Services. The gate had a padlock. He hit it with his shoulder 3 times and the chain gave on the 3rd. The side door was locked. He found a window. He put his elbow through the glass, cleared the jagged edge with his sleeve, and felt the interior air on his face, cold as a room that hasn't been heated in months, but still and windless in a way that felt like mercy. He got Sawyer through first, then himself. Inside, he found a wall switch. No power. He felt along surfaces until he knew what was there. Workbench, rusted shelves, a partially collapsed couch. He found a break room with nothing useful. He found a maintenance closet with shop rags in a dented metal barrel, and near the back wall, a pile of old paperwork and a container of something that smelled flammable when he cracked the lid. He moved the barrel to the center of the room. He made a pile of paper in the bottom, added a small amount of fuel from the container. He fashioned a wick from a strip of his shirt. He held the lighter he kept in his inside pocket for exactly these kinds of nights and touched the flame to the edge of the paper. It caught. The fire moved across the paper and onto the wick and grew into something small and fragile and entirely real. Heat. Not enough heat, but heat. He dragged Sawyer's weight gently off the floor and settled her as close to the barrel as was safe. He put his own jacket under her because the concrete would pull warmth from a body faster than almost anything else. He slid cardboard beneath that because cardboard between a body and concrete floor was the difference between making it and not. He packed the shop rags around her neck and her wrists and pulled what was left of her riding jacket as tight around her as the damaged shoulder would allow. She was shivering. Shivering was fight. Shivering meant her body was still trying to help itself. He sat beside her and pressed his fingers to her neck and found the pulse weak and irregular but continuous. And he exhaled something that was not quite relief but was close enough to function as one. He pulled out his phone. No service. He walked the room with it held up, checking every corner, every angle near the ceiling. One corner, near the broken window, gave him half a bar for approximately 2 seconds before it collapsed back to nothing. He put the phone away. He sat on the concrete with his back against the workbench and his legs stretched out, and he looked at the fire in the barrel and looked at Sawyer and looked at the eagle patch just visible inside the torn collar of her riding jacket, silver thread on black, felt the stitching, careful and precise. He did not know yet what it meant. He knew she had gotten off that mountain when getting off it should not have been possible. He knew she had made deliberate decisions at the crash site in the seconds before those men reached her, decisions that required a kind of cold, intelligent presence that had nothing to do with luck or instinct and everything to do with preparation. He knew she had hidden something in her boot that they had not found. He did not know what it was yet, but he knew it mattered because the careful, specific way she had moved her hand in those final seconds before the door opened had been the movement of someone protecting the thing that was most important. They had taken the bag. They had taken the phone. They had taken the patch. They had not gotten whatever was in her boot. He fed another sheet of paper into the barrel and watched the fire take it. Outside, the storm hit the building in waves, and then the knocking came. 3 impacts against the side door. Evenly spaced, deliberate, the precise rhythm of someone who was not trying to force entry but to announce presence. To let the people inside know that waiting was no longer a viable strategy. Colt went still. The knocking came again, same interval. The patience in it was worse than urgency would have been. A voice came through the metal door, muffled but clear enough. "Open up. We know you're in there." Across the room, Sawyer's eyes opened. She did not make a sound. She looked at Colt across the firelit space, and what he saw on her face was not fear. It was the same thing he had seen when she told him to stay on the slope side of the road. A mind that had encountered a new set of conditions and was already working through them. Her hand found his sleeve. She pulled him down to her level and put her mouth close to his ear. The voice outside said, "It's freezing. We're here to help." Sawyer said very quietly, "Name what you know." The fire burned in the barrel. Neither of them moved. Help didn't sound like that. Colt knew what help sounded like. He had heard it exactly twice in the past 8 months. Once from a woman at the county food bank who gave him a second container without being asked and did not make eye contact in the particular careful way of people who want to preserve a stranger's dignity. Once from a retired highway worker named Gerald, who had let him sleep in an equipment shed for 3 nights during the October cold snap and left a thermos of coffee outside the door each morning without knocking. Help had a quality to it, an absence of patience, because patience implied waiting for something, and real help didn't wait for conditions to be right before arriving. The voice outside was patient. That was the defining thing about it. 3 measured knocks, and then the offer, and then silence, like someone who had already surveyed the space and decided that urgency was not the argument they wanted to make tonight. Colt reached under the workbench without standing up. His fingers found the tire iron by its weight and shape in the dark. He picked it up and stood. Sawyer was watching him. He held up 2 fingers. She nodded once. She had already counted the voices. The knocking came again, same rhythm, same interval, and then a different sound on the far side of the room. Softer. The broken window, someone testing the frame from outside. Colt moved before he had fully formed the decision. He positioned himself between Sawyer and the pale rectangle of the window opening, keeping low using the shelf line as cover. He planted his feet on the concrete and held the tire iron and breathed through his nose and waited. A gloved hand appeared on the sill, then a second hand. A shape climbed through, hood low scarf pulled across the face so only the eyes showed dark clothing, and he dropped into the room with the practiced quiet of someone who had entered spaces this way before. Before his feet had fully settled, he had a flashlight out and the beam was moving across the room. It found Sawyer first. The man set into something at his collar, Found her, not relief, not concern, confirmation. The word of someone crossing an item off a list. Colt stepped out of the shadow and swung. The tire iron caught the man's forearm. The flashlight flew and spun across the concrete, throwing rotating circles of light across the walls, and in those wild, sweeping flashes, Colt took stock. The man was larger than he had appeared coming through the window. He recovered from the impact, quickly rolling it off his arm, the way someone rolls off contact that has happened to them before, and what he pulled from inside his jacket was not what Colt had been bracing for. It was a phone, pale blue case, scuffed at the corners. Sawyer's phone. The man held it up, palm out. Relax, returning lost property. Colt did not lower the tire iron. He looked at the man's boots. Heavy tread, steel-toed. The second man came through the window while they were still positioned. Taller than the first, broader, a heavy beard, and the weather-flushed complexion of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors doing things that required physical effort. He landed harder than the first and immediately began scanning the room with the economical thoroughness of someone who had done this kind of work before and knew what to look for. The scarfed man spread his hands in a gesture of openness that didn't reach his eyes. We got a call. She's injured. We can take her somewhere warm. Colt said nothing. The man took one step forward, and the firelight from the barrel caught his face above the scarf, and Sawyer spoke, not loud, just clear. His name is Reardon Slade. The room went still. Slade's eyes cut to her, and something moved behind them that was not friendliness and not surprise. The particular expression of a man who has been named in a room where being named means something specific. She's confused, he said. She's been hypothermic for hours. She doesn't know what she's saying. Sawyer looked directly at him. You were at my car window. After the crash, I heard you talking. I know your voice. Slade's jaw shifted. The bearded man Pruitt glanced toward the side door, one glance measuring distance. Colt moved before either of them could complete their calculations. He drove the tire iron low and hard into Pruitt's shin. The pain response was immediate and genuine, and Pruitt folded sideways into the shelving, and tools clattered off the edge and rang on the concrete like a series of small bells. Slade came at Colt from the left, and Colt caught him across the forearm with the tire iron and shoved, and Slade hit the wall and came back faster than expected and drove a fist into Colt's ribs on the right side. The pain was extraordinary. Air left in a way that didn't feel voluntary. Colt did not go down. He converted the pain into forward motion and grabbed the flashlight off the floor and drove the hard edge of the housing into Slade's face. Slade hissed and turned away. And then the barrel moved. Sawyer had crossed the room on her hands and knees during the fight, tracking the positions of both men while Colt occupied their attention. She put both palms against the metal barrel and pushed with everything her shoulder and her cracked ribs would allow. The barrel went over with a sound like a struck bell rolling toward the window embers and smoke spreading across the floor in a rough line between Slade and the room. Not a fire. A wall of smoke and scattered heat that neither man wanted to step through, and in the 3 seconds that bought them, Colt had Sawyer up and they were moving toward the far end of the room. She was the compass. He was the engine. The rolling garage door was frozen in its track. He found a crowbar on the floor and jammed it under the bottom lip and pried, and the door groaned and ice fractured along the frame, and a gap opened at the bottom. He dropped to his knees and pushed her through first and followed, and the cold of the exterior hit them like a wall they had forgotten was waiting. He got them upright and across the yard and through the broken gate and out to the road, and the night was open in all directions. Headlights appeared at the far end of the road. Not one set, multiple, spreading across the road surface in a way that was not the movement of traffic, but the deliberate geometry of people establishing positions. A truck slid into place across the exit. Behind it, 2 more vehicles spacing themselves with the precision of a practiced maneuver. They were boxed in. Behind them, the sound of Slade dropping from the broken window into the yard. Deputy Breckenvale climbed out of the lead truck. He moved the way men move when they consider the space they occupy to be theirs by right. County jacket, badge catching the headlight beam. He swept his flashlight over the scene in front of him, and the expression on his face was not the expression of someone encountering an unexpected situation. It was the expression of someone arriving at a place he had already scripted. He stood in the snow as if the blizzard were beneath his notice and said in a tone so conversational it had its own particular menace, "Sawyer Merritt, we've been looking for you." Her name first, her full name. Not, "Are you hurt?" Not, "What happened?" Her name spoken as the opening line of a script that had already been written. Sawyer's hand tightened on Colt's arm. He felt her feel the same thing he felt. Vale's light moved to the tire iron in Colt's hand. "Put it down," he said. Colt set it down in the snow carefully. A tool on the ground was still a tool. Slade and Pruitt drifted into position at angles behind them. The geometry was complete. They had done this before, all three of them, and they knew where to stand. Vale approached Sawyer and took her arm with the professional firmness of someone who expected compliance to be automatic. She let him take her arm, and in that moment of contact, she turned her face toward the far end of the road where a single headlight had appeared from the north. Then a second beside it, then three more. The sound of engines, multiple and distinct, rolling up through the pass from a direction that implied a great deal of organized movement. Vale registered the lights and his grip tightened. "In the truck," he said to Slade. "Now." Sawyer went where she was directed. She got into the back of the truck, and the door closed, and Colt heard the lock engage, and the tinted glass took her away. Vale turned to Colt. "You're going to tell me what you found and where you found it," he said. "Right now, while this is still a conversation." Colt kept his eyes on the truck door. "She needs a hospital. Fractured ribs, hypothermia." She stopped breathing on the road. Vale's expression remained unchanged. "She's warm. She's fine. What did you take from the— I mean, she is not fine. She needs— What did you take from the car?" From inside the truck came a sound, oineon. Not a cry, something deliberate. A fist hitting glass. Once, twice, and then Sawyer's voice muffled by the steel and tinting, but unmistakable in its character, not pleading, communicating, saying something specific at a volume calculated to carry through the door. Colt could not make out the words, but he could see her face in the narrow gap where the window tinting was thinnest, and she was not looking at the door she was hitting. She was looking at the window surface. She was using something to mark it. He didn't understand yet what she was doing. 43 miles south and east of Ridgecrest Pass, at the edge of a diner parking lot off Route 9, Dax Merritt sat on his motorcycle with his phone pressed to his ear and the call going to voicemail for the fourth consecutive time. He ended the call. He sat very still with his hands on the tank and the engine cooling beneath him and the snow coming down in the parking lot lights in the particular way it came down when a serious storm was fully settled and in no hurry to move on. He had known Sawyer's route. He had helped her plan it. Denver to Ridgecrest to Briar Ridge, a route she had made a dozen times, a route that in reasonable conditions took an hour 20 from the city, and in bad conditions took longer, and in conditions like tonight's took however long it took, because Sawyer Merritt knew that road and would not rush it. She had called him from the lawyer's office parking structure at 11:35 and said she was leaving and she would call when she was through the pass. It was now 12:47. Dax was not a man who talked himself out of things he already understood. He went back inside the diner and stood at the edge of the room and looked at the 18 men sitting at the long, pushed-together table near the back. Some were eating, some were not. All of them looked up when the door opened and they saw his face. He said two words, "Saddle up." 18 chairs pushed back from the table in the same motion. He was already on the phone before he reached the door, working down a call chain that had been built 4 years ago and never needed to be activated. First number, 2 rings, 3 words. Next number. He was on the highway on-ramp before the 8th call connected. By the time he hit the first long straightaway north of Cedar Flats, 412 people had received the message and were moving. Back at the County Road Services yard, Vale had stopped asking questions. He had moved to a different method. He had put Colt against the hood of the truck, face down on cold metal, and was letting the position make its own argument while he talked into his radio with the voice reserved for official communications. Colt turned his head sideways and breathed in thought. He was thinking about the moment Sawyer had let Vale take her arm. Not the resignation of it, the deliberateness. She had made a calculation in the 2 seconds between understanding she was going into that truck and actually going into it, and the calculation had produced a decision, and the decision had involved something she was now doing inside the vehicle that he couldn't see. He was still working through this when Slade came around the side of the truck. The search was professional in its efficiency and completely wrong in its execution because the hands that went through Colt's jacket were looking for something specific, not conducting a genuine security check, and they went directly to the lining of the left interior panel with the confidence of someone who had put something there and needed to confirm it was still in place. The pouch appeared in Slade's hand. Colt had never seen it before. He had no idea how it had gotten into his jacket, but he knew with complete certainty that it had arrived there while Vale had him pinned to the hood and while the snow was falling and while everyone's attention was on the truck that held Sawyer. Slade unzipped it slowly, inside a pale blue phone, and beneath it folded in a clear plastic sleeve a patch, Silver Eagle on black felt. Vale turned toward the growing line of headlights that had stacked up at the north end of the road. The bike line had grown from 5 to 20 to something he could no longer count individually. He held the pouch up where every camera pointed at him could see it. "Recovered stolen property from the suspect," he said. Colt raised his head. "That's not mine." "Your jacket," Vale said. He did not look at Colt when he said it. He was watching the cameras. "I've never seen it before today." "Your jacket," Vale said again. Same two words, same measured tone. Repetition as substitution for evidence. One of the bikers near the front of the line had his phone held horizontally steady recording without commentary. 2 rows back a second phone was up. Farther along the line someone clicked on a supplemental light that washed Vale's badge number in sharp white. They had been recording since before they stopped. And then the lead bike went quiet. The rider dismounted. He moved through the snow with the unhurried deliberateness of a large man who understands that speed has never been his most persuasive attribute. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that came from decades of physical work. His hair was dark gray, shaved close at the sides, pushed back from a face that was all angles and weather. His beard was white and long, reaching his chest, and the cold had put ice crystals in it that caught the headlights of the vehicles behind him. Both arms were covered from shoulder to wrist in ink so dense that in the low light it read as a single dark sleeve, and he wore his vest with no shirt beneath it because the temperature was a condition he acknowledged and did not negotiate with. He walked to within 20 feet of the truck and stopped. He looked at Colt first. He examined him with the complete attention of someone making an inventory. The blood on the forearm, the torn shoulder of the jacket. The particular way Colt was holding himself protective of the right side where the ribs had taken the impact. Then he looked at the truck. From inside it, a fist hit the glass, and then Sawyer's voice came through, muffled by steel and tinting, but shaped with a precision that carried through all of it, not crying out, reciting. Numbers and words, structured and deliberate, the kind of communication that was designed to be understood even through obstruction. Colt heard it now. She was reading Vale's badge number through the glass. The number she had memorized and scratched into the condensation with the edge of her seatbelt buckle before anyone outside the truck realized what the sound of movement in it meant. Dax Merritt stopped in front of Vale. He looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Open the door." Vale said, "Sir, she's being transported to the hospital. She's receiving care. I need you to step back from the open the door." Oh, 2 words. No louder than the first time, but different in a way that was not about volume. A voice from the middle of the bike line. "Name your badge number for the camera, deputy." Vale did not respond. Another voice, different position. "What's the legal basis for detaining the juvenile?" No response. Vale was doing math. Colt could see it from the hood. The way his eyes moved across the line of bikes, counting lenses, calculating what had been captured and what had not, trying to find the version of this story that he could still write. Dax watched him calculate. He let it go on exactly long enough to make clear he had seen it. Then he looked at Colt. "What's your name?" he said. Colt said Colt Hadley. Dax nodded once. "Colt, did you carry my daughter off that mountain?" "Yes." "Did you take anything from her?" "No." "Did you hurt her?" "No." A pause. "She stopped breathing at mile 9. I did CPR for about 4 minutes. She came back." Something moved across Dax's face that was not meant to be seen by anyone watching. He closed it off in less than a second, and what replaced it was the controlled stillness of a man who has decided that the most important thing is to finish the task in front of him before he allows himself to feel anything else. He turned back to the truck. "Deputy," he said. "Last time." Vale's jaw moved, and then a new set of headlights appeared from the south. A state police SUV pushing up through the blizzard with its light bar running. Vale's posture shifted. The shift of someone who has just been handed what they think is a useful tool. Trooper Desmond Webb climbed out. He read the scene in the practiced way of someone trained to identify disorder quickly, and what he read slowed his approach. Too many bikes, a county deputy with a juvenile pinned to the hood of his truck. Two other men positioned at angles that didn't fit the implied story. A fist still striking the interior of the vehicle. Webb looked at Vale. "What's the situation?" "Suspect detained," Vale said. "Minor female located. Civilian interference with an active scene." Webb looked at Colt, at the blood, at the ribs, at the posture. "Let him up," Webb said. "He's detained. He needs medical attention. Let him up, deputy." Vale held the pressure for one long second, then eased. Colt pushed off the hood and stood. His ribs fired on the first full breath. He kept his expression level. Webb looked at Dax. Dax said, "My daughter is in that vehicle. She's injured. That boy." He did not point at Slade. He simply moved his gaze toward him and let the directions speak. "Planted items in this kid's jacket while the deputy had him pinned. We have it recorded. 3 different angles." Webb looked at Slade. Slade spread his hands. "County Road Services. We responded to a property alarm. Your name," a pause. "Reardon Slade." Something shifted in Webb's posture. Small and controlled, but Colt caught it. The shift of someone who has heard a name in an unexpected context and is connecting it to a context where it belongs. Webb looked at Vale. He looked at the truck. He looked at the pouch in Slade's hand. His radio went off. Not dispatch, a specific number. A voice that was measured and deliberate and coming from somewhere that was not visible. Sergeant Theron Graves. Colt did not know the name yet. He would know it very well by morning. The call was short, 3 sentences. When it ended, Webb stood still with the particular stillness of a man who has just been told something that requires him to choose between 2 things that cannot simultaneously be true. He looked at the pouch. He looked at Colt. He looked at Dax. And then he walked to the truck's rear door and put his hand on the handle. "Don't," Vale said. "Back up." "She's in the middle of a medical—" Webb opened the door. Cold air rolled into the cab. Sawyer turned toward the opening and shifted toward the door, one hand braced against the seat back, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing damage and not letting it stop her. Her face was pale. Her shoulders sat wrong. There was dried blood above her left ear from the crash. But her eyes were clear, and they went past Webb directly to Dax. And what moved between them in that moment did not need language to carry its full weight. She said, "Dad." Dax covered the distance in 2 strides. He caught her under the arms as she came out of the truck and pulled her against his chest in a single motion. One hand at her shoulder, one hand at the back of her head, assessing damage with the hands of a man who has repaired enough things to know what broken feels like before he can see it. She winced hard when his hand passed over her right side. He felt it and went still. "Here," she said quietly. "Right side, maybe 2 ribs." He adjusted his hold without releasing her. "They framed Colt," she said. Slade put the pouch in his jacket while Vale had him on the hood. "Check the video." A breath. And check my boot." Dax's eyes moved to Vale. Vale said, "She's been hypothermic for hours. She's disoriented. That's why we need to transport her and let medical professionals." Sawyer turned her face toward the recording phones along the bike line. She said in a voice that was rough from the night but clear enough to carry, "My name is Sawyer Merritt, Deputy Vale badge number." And she read the number she had memorized and scratched into the condensation on the truck's rear window before anyone outside realized what the sounds of movement inside meant. "Was at my car at mile marker 18 after the crash. Reardon Slade and Garrett Pruitt took my bag. They took my phone. They took the Iron Crest patch. I heard Slade say that Graves had given the order." The name Graves landed in the snow. Webb's radio crackled. A different voice this time, coming from vehicles that had appeared from the direction of Briar Ridge while the confrontation was unfolding. County vehicles. 3 of them moving into position with the organized confidence of people who have been waiting for a cue. Sergeant Theron Graves climbed out of the lead vehicle. He was broad and deliberate, wearing sergeant stripes and the expression of a man who had managed difficult situations from a position of institutional authority for long enough that it had become indistinguishable from his natural posture. He took in the bikes and the cameras and the positions of everyone on the road, and then he said, "Trooper Webb, you're out of your jurisdiction. Stand down." Webb did not stand down. "I called your dispatch on the way up the Pesam," Webb said evenly. "They have no record of you being assigned to Ridgecrest tonight, Sergeant." The temperature dropped, not the weather. Graves looked at Webb with the expression of someone whose calculation has just required a significant revision. Dax said without raising his voice, "Flynn Decker." Graves went very still. "He died on this pass," Dax said, "8 months ago, on a night that looked a lot like this one." A pause. Sawyer. Sawyer reached down along the inside of her right boot with her good hand. She peeled back the edge of the insole and worked the micro SD card out with 2 fingers. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger and turned it toward the nearest recording phone, not toward the adults standing around her. She understood what the camera needed to see, and she gave it that before anything else. "This is what they came for," she said. Every engine on the bike line went off, not simultaneously. In a rolling wave, front to back, 500 engines going quiet over the course of about 3 seconds, the sound moving backward through the line like a tide going out. The silence that replaced it was the loudest thing Colt had ever stood inside. Graves looked at the line of bikes, at the phones, at the card in Sawyer's hand, at Webb, who had his body cam running and his hand near his radio, and the expression of someone who has made a choice and intends to stand in it. And then from above the pass, from a direction that was not the road, came a sound that was not engines and not wind. Rotors. A searchlight broke through the snow from the northeast, sweeping down across the road in a white beam that turned the falling snow into something luminous and turned everyone caught inside it into something too visible to lie comfortably within. The voice through the loudspeaker was distorted by distance and wind, but clear enough. "This is Colorado State Air Support. All units on Ridgecrest Pass, hold your positions. Do not move any individual or any evidence. Identify yourselves." Vale's hand dropped away from his radio. Slade took one step backward. Pruitt looked at the helicopter and at Graves and at the 500 silent bikes, and his face had the look of a man who has been running arithmetic in his head and has arrived at an answer he does not want but cannot dispute. Graves stood in the searchlight with the expression of a man who has run out of road. Sawyer looked at the light, then she looked at Colt standing beside the truck with broken ribs and a forearm wrapped in cloth and blood dried on his face, and she held the micro SD card up one more time. Not for the cameras, for him. She had carried it through the crash and the 9 miles and the 2 men and the fire and the fight and the CPR and all the dark. She had made the decision to hide it in the 3 seconds between seeing those headlights accelerate toward her from behind and the moment of impact. She had kept that decision through every moment since, through everything the night had been, and now she was holding it up in a helicopter searchlight on a Colorado mountain pass at 2:30 in the morning, and the card was intact, and the file was on it, and they had not gotten it. Colt looked at the card. He looked at her. "That was in your boot the whole time," he said. "The whole time," she said. Above them, the helicopter held position. The snow kept falling. The engine stayed silent. And Theron Graves stood in the white beam of the state's light and understood with the particular clarity of a man who has run completely out of moves that the night had not ended the way he had planned. Dax kept his hand at the back of Sawyer's head and did not look at any of it. He was looking at his daughter. The searchlight did not move. It held the road in a circle of white that made everything inside it visible and everything outside it irrelevant. And for a moment that stretched past its natural length, nobody on Ridgecrest Pass did anything at all. The snow fell through the beam and turned silver. The wind kept working. The helicopter held its position with the patience of something that had fuel to burn and no conflicting obligations. Then Lieutenant Petra Holt's voice came through the loudspeaker again. "Sergeant Graves, step away from the state vehicle." Graves did not step away. He stood in the light with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and the expression of a man attempting to determine how much damage control was still possible. He had been building this county for 11 years. Carefully, the way you build something you intend to outlast you. Vale was his. The vehicles positioned behind him were his. The story he had driven up here to finish writing was supposed to have been his by now. He looked at the micro SD card in Sawyer's hand. He looked at it the way you look at a small object that has somehow become the largest thing in the room. Trooper Webb took one step sideways and placed his body between Graves and Sawyer without drawing and without raising his voice. Just movement. Just position. Everything he needed to say expressed in the single choice of where he chose to stand. Graves looked at him. "Webb," he said. One word carrying the full architecture of what it was intended to carry. Rank, history, the long-standing arrangement between county and state in Briar Ridge that most people had stopped noticing was an arrangement rather than a law. Webb said, "Body cam's been running since I came up the pass, Sergeant. Continuous." A beat of silence. "Mine died," Vale said. "I know," Webb said. "We'll pull the data card when it comes in for service. See exactly when it died and what was recorded before it did." Vale said nothing. The helicopter descended 200 more feet, and the searchlight expanded to cover not just the central cluster of figures, but the county vehicles behind Graves and the positions of Slade and Pruitt, both of whom had been moving in the direction of the tree line on the south side of the road in the incremental way of men, considering whether darkness was worth the attempt. A second voice came over the loudspeaker. Different cadence. Someone reading from notes. "Reardon Slade, Garrett Pruitt, you are visible to state air support. Do not move." Slade stopped moving. Pruitt looked up at the helicopter with the expression of a man who has spent years depending on the absence of witnesses and is now confronting what their presence actually costs. Dax had not moved. He was still holding the Sawyer against his chest. One hand at her ribs, one hand at the back of her head, and he was looking at Graves with the look of a man who has been trying to understand something for a long time and has finally in this specific moment seen it completely. He said Flynn Decker left his daughter a letter. Graves's eyes shifted. "He wrote it 2 weeks before he died," Dax said. "He wrote it because he understood that something was going to happen on a road like this one, and he wanted a record somewhere that couldn't be confiscated or burned or lost in a filing system that someone controlled. The lawyers in Denver have a copy, his daughter has a copy, and the Colorado Attorney General's office received a copy by certified mail 6 weeks ago." The wind moved through the silence between words. "The flash drive in Sawyer's bag," Dax said. "The one your men took at the crash site. That was the original file. 3 years of financial records. 71 transactions. Names, dates, amounts." He paused. "Including yours." Graves's hand moved toward his belt. Every phone on the bike line tracked the motion in real time. He stopped. Webb said quietly, "Don't." Graves looked at the cameras, at the helicopter, at the 500 bikes lining the road in both directions, at Sawyer, who was still holding the micro SD card, and looking at him with the clear-eyed directness she had used to look at Slade in a dark building, which was the same directness she had used to look at everything all night, which was the directness of someone who has been taught that seeing clearly is the first and most essential form of protection. He looked at Colt standing beside the truck with cracked ribs and a forearm wrapped in torn cloth and blood dried on his face, who looked back at him with the steadiness of someone who has already been through the worst part and is simply waiting for the rest to resolve itself. Graves looked at all of it. Then he looked at Vale. Vale looked back. Something passed between them in that look. Not a plan. The end of one. Webb had his radio in his hand. He said, "State Dispatch, this is Trooper Webb. I need 2 additional units at Ridgecrest, marker 18, and I need county affairs, contact on the line. I have a county sergeant and a county deputy whose accounts of tonight's events are materially inconsistent with physical evidence and with multiple civilian recordings." He paused. "I also need EMS for 2 juveniles, one with rib fractures and hypothermia, one with shoulder separation and possible concussion." Static. Then, "Copy Webb, units en route. EMS is 20 minutes out." Vale's mouth tightened. He looked at Colt, at the truck, at the pouch still in Slade's hand. He was doing the same arithmetic Pruitt had been doing and arriving at the same answer, and unlike Pruitt, he was not looking at the tree line. He was looking at the cameras and making a different calculation. The calculation of a man who has been in trouble before and understands that the depth of that trouble is partly determined by his own behavior at the precise moment when the trouble becomes impossible to deny. He let the pouch drop into the snow. Slade looked at it. Then Slade looked at the helicopter. Then Slade ran. He went south along the fence line, away from the bikes, into the dark at the edge of the searchlight's reach. A flat sprint, no hesitation, the decision executed before anyone could counter it, and for 4 seconds he was moving fast enough that the outcome was genuinely unclear. Then two things happened at the same moment. The helicopter's searchlight pivoted and followed him. And a state police SUV that had been sitting dark at the south end of the road with its engine off for the past 8 minutes turned on its lights and pulled directly across his path. Slade stopped. He stood in the convergence of two light sources with nowhere to go, and his hands came up slowly, not because anyone had instructed him to raise them, but because the body makes certain decisions automatically when it understands that the available options have been reduced to one. Pruitt did not run. He looked at where Slade had stopped and at the lights surrounding him, and he placed his hands on the hood of the nearest county vehicle without being asked. He did it slowly and carefully, the way a man places his hands on a surface when he is very tired, and the surface is the only stable thing remaining. Webb walked to Vale. "Deputy Vale, I'm placing you under investigative detention pending review of tonight's events. You are not under formal arrest at this time." "Do you understand?" Vale said. "I want a lawyer." "That's your right," Webb said. "Hands." Graves watched the cuffs go on Vale. He watched Webb walk toward him. He said, "You understand what you're doing?" Webb said, "Yes." "You understand who you're doing it to?" "Yes." Graves looked past Webb at Dax, at Sawyer, at the micro SD card that had traveled 9 miles in a 16-year-old girl's boot through a crash, in a blizzard, and 2 men who had been sent to make certain it never reached its destination. He said nothing else. Webb put a hand on his arm and walked him to the state SUV, and Graves went without resistance, with the composure of a man who has decided that the only thing left to control is the manner of his own departure. Dax sat down in the snow, not from weakness. He lowered himself until he was sitting with his back against the side of the truck and Sawyer against his chest and his arms around her, and he let the rest of the night proceed around him while he held his daughter and breathed. She let him. She pressed her face against the front of his vest and let herself be held the way she had not let herself be held all night, because being held was not something you could afford when there was still ground to cover. The ground was covered now. She had done everything she came to do. She had carried what needed to be carried and kept it safe and delivered it. After a while, she said, "Colt." Dax lifted his head and found Colt still beside the truck. He was leaning slightly against the front quarter panel, not dramatically, just in the way of someone for whom remaining vertical had become an active maintenance project. His right arm was crossed over his ribs. His eyes were on the helicopter. Dax said, "Colt, come here." Colt looked over. He pushed off from the truck and walked over and stood in the snow, and Dax looked him over the way he had looked him over when he first arrived. The forearm, the ribs, the jacket that had kept none of the cold out. "Sit down," Dax said. Colt sat down in the snow. He sat with his back against the same truck 2 feet from Dax and Sawyer, and pulled his knees up and rested his forearms on them, and exhaled a breath that seemed to carry several miles in it. The breath of someone setting down something they have been carrying for a long time. The helicopter held its position. The light line of 500 bikes stretched back as far as the snow allowed anyone to see. All of them silent, all of them present. 500 people standing in a blizzard at 2:30 in the morning on a Colorado mountain pass, because a message had traveled down a chain that had been built for exactly this kind of night and had held in every link. One of the riders near the front came over and shook out a thermal blanket and handed it to Dax without speaking, and walked back to his bike. Dax wrapped it around Sawyer's shoulders. Sawyer reached across the space and put the other half of the blanket across Colt's leg. He looked at it. Then he pulled it the rest of the way over himself and said nothing. The state supervisor's voice carried from the direction of the SUV where Graves had been seated. "The flash drive from the bag, where is it now?" Webb said. "Slade dropped it when he ran. My unit is securing it." "And the SD card?" Webb looked toward Dax and Sawyer. Dax said to Sawyer, "Your call." Sawyer looked at the card in her hand. She thought about Flynn Decker, about the letter he had written to his daughter, about the 2 years he had spent collecting what was on this card while living in a county where collecting it was the most dangerous thing a person could choose to do. About the 8 months her father had carried the weight of knowing how those 2 years had ended. She held the card out to the state supervisor directly. Chain of custody from me personally, she said. Don't route it through county. The supervisor looked at the 16-year-old girl with the damaged shoulder and the blood in her hair and the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has thought through the handoff before making it. Understood, she said. She took the card with gloved fingers and held it up where every recording device still running could document the transfer. She sealed it in an evidence bag from her vest pocket, wrote the time on the outside, and initialed it. That was when Sawyer's phone completed its upload. It made no sound. There was no notification. Somewhere on a server in a facility in Northern Virginia, a voice memo file that had been queued since 12:15 a.m. finished transferring because the helicopter's communications equipment had opened a clean signal over the pass for the first time all night. The file was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. It began with road noise and wind and the sounds of a mountain pass at night. At 1 minute and 43 seconds, when the passenger door of Sawyer's car opened, two voices became clearly audible. The conversation they had in the hearing of a phone Sawyer had placed face down in the center console before they reached her covered enough ground to serve as a confession that no one had intended to give. The key sentence came near the end from Pruitt when Slade mentioned the name of Flynn Decker. And Pruitt said, with the casual certainty of someone who considers the matter long settled, same as Decker. The file sat on the server and waited. It would wait until morning when the lawyer in Denver would find it in the backup account and sit very still with his coffee going cold beside his keyboard before picking up his phone. But the file existed now. It was safe. It had survived everything the night had been. Slade didn't know that yet. Pruitt didn't know it. Graves, sitting in the back of a state SUV watching the searchlight through tinted glass, did not know it. But Sawyer knew. She had pressed record in the 2 seconds before impact, and the phone had been where she left it, and the upload had found its signal. She held that knowledge quietly, the way you hold a good thing when you are still too exhausted to do anything with it but be glad it exists. The ambulance arrived at 3:04 a.m. with a state police escort. It came up the pass with its lights going careful on the ice, and it pulled into the space the county vehicles had vacated. Two paramedics climbed out with the efficient, unhurried movement of people who have been doing this long enough to know that accuracy produces better outcomes than speed. They went to Sawyer first. Dax stood when they approached. He kept one hand on Sawyer's good shoulder while they assessed her. The lead paramedic moved through the examination with a brisk competence that Sawyer matched, answering each question in complete sentences, neither understating nor overstating. Right side ribs, 2 fractured, possibly 3. Left shoulder separation, not dislocation. Core temperature low, but not in the critical range. Scalp laceration from the crash, more dramatic in appearance than in severity. The paramedic said, "We're going to board you." Sawyer said, "Check him first." The paramedic looked at Colt sitting against the truck with the thermal blanket across his legs. She looked back at Sawyer. "He carried me 9 miles in a blizzard," Sawyer said, "and did CPR in the snow. Check him first." The paramedic looked at Dax. Dax looked at Sawyer. He nodded. The second paramedic went to Colt and crouched down and began the same assessment. Colt answered the questions in the flat, economical way of someone who has been taught by circumstance to give accurate information without editorializing. When the paramedic pressed along his right side, Colt's breath caught sharply, and the paramedic said, "2 confirmed, possibly 3. We need you horizontal." Colt said, "She goes first." "You both go," the paramedic said. "We have room." They loaded Sawyer first carefully, the board keeping her spine stable while they managed the shoulder, and then they helped Colt up, and he moved with the considered stiffness of someone operating on reserves that had been empty for the last 2 miles without acknowledgement. Dax walked beside the stretcher to the ambulance doors. He put his hand briefly on Colt's arm. Not a grip, not a gesture with an implied obligation, just a hand on an arm, the way you acknowledge something that doesn't have a precise word for it yet. Colt looked at him. Dax said, "I've got you." 3 words. The same weight as 3 words he had said to his daughter 3 years ago when he placed a patch in her hand. The same architecture, an assertion and a promise and a recognition compressed into the smallest space they could occupy. Colt looked at him for a moment. Then he got into the ambulance. Briar Ridge Regional Hospital sat at the base of the eastern slope of the pass, a low building that had been expanded twice in its history and still managed to feel like something that had been there before the town grew around it. The parking lot had been plowed, but the fresh snow was already working at the edges of what the plow had done. The ambulance pulled in at 3:19 a.m. The intake clerk at the overnight desk had been working nights at Briar Ridge Regional for 11 years and had developed in that time a particular fluency in reading what came through the door at 3 in the morning. She read Colt before the paramedics had finished their handoff. The clothes, the age, the absence of anyone accompanying him, the word in the radio traffic she had caught and filed away. She looked at her screen and began typing. The automatic doors opened behind her. She did not look up. Ma'am, she looked up. Sawyer Merritt was standing 6 feet from the desk in a hospital gown over her riding jacket, one arm in a temporary sling, the IV line they had started in the ambulance running to a rolling stand she was managing with her good hand. She had clearly got Tian off the gurney in the intake bay before anyone had formally agreed to that decision. The boy who just came in, Sawyer said. Colt Hadley. He walked 9 miles in a blizzard with cracked ribs to bring me here. I need to know he's going to be treated the same way you're treating me. The clerk looked at her. And I need to know the word homeless in whatever report you just received is not going to change that. Behind Sawyer, Dax came through the automatic doors. He was still in his vest, no shirt, ice crystals remaining in his beard from the ride down the mountain, and he looked at the intake desk with the calm of a man who understands exactly how institutions function and is prepared to interact with one. The clerk looked at the screen, at Sawyer, at Dax, at the doors where through the glass the parking lot was becoming something it had not been when the ambulance arrived. The first row of headlights had come in off the main road, then the second row, then the third and fourth, and the rows beyond those. They were not parking in the marked spaces. They were lining the perimeter of the lot in an arrangement that had a deliberate shape to it, the shape of people who have decided where they intend to be and have no plans to be elsewhere. The engines went off, one by one, then in clusters, then the remainder all at once. The silence they left behind was complete. 500 people standing in the snow outside a hospital at 3:20 in the morning in the cold without being asked, without a reason that could be entered in a form or verified against the database. Just present, just there. The clerk looked at Sawyer. Sawyer looked back at her. The clerk said, "He'll be seen by Dr. Okafor. Best trauma assessment we have available on nights." A pause. "Room 4 is adjacent to room 3. I'll put you both on the same hall." Sawyer said, "Thank you." She turned and walked back toward the bay, the IV stand rolling alongside her, and Dax held the inner door without comment. They put Colt in room 4. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling tiles and listened to the sounds of the hospital moving around him. Sounds that were not wind and not snow, and not the particular creak of a metal building being worked at by a mountain blizzard. His body having been given something approximating horizontal and something approximating warm for the first time in hours, began the long process of accounting for what it had spent. The accounting covered considerable ground. The nurse who came in to take his vitals was a man named Earl, who moved with the unhurried competence of someone who has been on nights long enough to have seen most of what a night could contain. He examined Colt's forearm and cleaned the laceration with a thoroughness that suggested he intended to do the job correctly, regardless of how many other things required doing. He checked the ribs with careful hands, confirmed with experienced touch what the imaging would later confirm in pictures, and wrapped a warm blanket around Colt's shoulders with the matter-of-fact care of someone who does not distinguish between patients who deserve good care and patients who do not. He left a cup of hot chocolate on the bedside table and went to the door. He stopped. "The girl in room 3, he said. "She asked me to tell you the ribs will heal." Colt looked at him. "Her exact words," Earl said. He went out. Colt looked at the ceiling. He was thinking about the tire iron in the snow, about the fire in the barrel, about Sawyer's hands pressing down on his chest when he opened his eyes on the concrete floor and found her there doing the work of keeping someone alive with the same methodical calm she had brought to everything else. He was thinking about the moment she held the micro SD card up toward the recording phone, rather than toward the adults who could have taken it and managed it and made it part of a process she didn't control, because she understood what the camera needed to see and she gave it that before she gave anything else. The door opened. Sawyer came in with the IV stand and the sling and the careful movement of someone managing two damaged things simultaneously. She moved the chair to the side of his bed and sat in it and looked at him in the way you look at someone after a very long night when the looking itself is sufficient and words are things you can take your time getting to. He said, "You should be horizontal." She said, "I will be." A silence settled over the room that was not uncomfortable. The hospital moved around them, carts and voices and the low persistent sounds of a building doing its work. She said, "When they put me in the truck, I used the seatbelt buckle on the window." He said, "I know, I heard you reading the badge number. I needed the cameras to have it." She looked at her good hand. It was the only thing I could do from in there. It worked. It worked because people were recording. She looked at the window. 100 people in a parking lot in a blizzard at 3 in the morning. Your father called them. He called the first 18, she said. They called the rest. A pause. That's what the chain is for. He built it because he knew that someday there would be a night where having it would matter more than the cost of maintaining it. Colt said, he built it for a night like Flynn Decker's. Sawyer looked at him. Yes, she said, except tonight it was different. How? Because tonight someone was there from the beginning. She met his eyes. At the car, before anyone else got there, before the chain was even activated. She let that sit for a moment. You were just there. He said nothing. She said, I heard you say it on the road. I don't think you knew I heard, but I did. He looked at the window. She kept moving, she said. You said it like it was true before it was true, like you were saying it to make it true. He turned back to look at her. It was already true, he said. You just needed something to follow. She looked at him for a moment that did not require filling. Then she said, the recording, on my phone. What about it? I pressed record on purpose. She said it simply without drama. Not by accident. I had 2 seconds between seeing the lights come up fast behind me and the impact, and I used them to press record because my dad taught me that the truth doesn't protect itself. You have to build a structure around it, or it gets replaced by something easier to believe. She paused. I didn't know if the upload would complete. I didn't know if the phone would survive being in Slade's pocket. I didn't know any of it. I just made the decision, and then I had to wait for it to matter. Colt thought about the weight of carrying a decision through 9 miles and 2 fights and CPR and a metal building and a sheriff's hood and all the rest of it, not knowing if the decision would prove to have been worth making. He said it mattered. It mattered, she agreed. The door opened. Dax came in without knocking, which was not discourtesy but the particular spatial confidence of someone for whom rooms had never been meaningful barriers. He looked at Sawyer in the chair and at Colt in the bed and pulled the second chair to the other side of the room and sat in it. He said to Sawyer, Dr. Okafor wants you back in room 3. She said, I know. He said, 5 minutes. She almost smiled. Dax reached into his vest pocket and placed 3 folded pieces of paper on the bedside table beside the hot chocolate. He placed them carefully side by side, and then he sat back. Colt looked at them. Top one is a housing placement, Dax said. A room, private, in Briar Ridge, paid through the spring. A pause. Second is a lawyer, not connected to the club, not connected to this county. She handles juvenile records and emancipation proceedings. She's already been contacted tonight. Another pause. Third is a social worker, works from the state office in Denver. She doesn't know Graves. She doesn't know Vale. She has no connections to anyone in Briar Ridge County. Colt looked at the papers. He did not reach for them. Dax said, you're not owing anything. You're not joining anything. Colt said, then what is it? Dax looked at him with the directness of a man who does not waste the kind of word that carries the most weight. My daughter is alive, he said, because you did not walk away when walking away was the easier choice. Colt looked at the ceiling. After a moment, he said, I almost did walk away before I heard her. But you didn't. No. That's the whole thing, Dax said. Right there. A silence fell over the room that had the quality of something that did not need to be extended or concluded. The kind of silence that occurs when the necessary things have been said and both parties understand that adding to them would cost more than it would contribute. Sawyer stood up. She moved to the bedside table and put her good hand over the 3 papers and slid them toward Colt until they rested against his arm. She said she kept moving. He looked at her. "That's what I want to tell you," she said. "You kept saying it on the road, and I want you to know that it worked both ways." She held his eyes. "You kept moving too, the whole way." He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was not entirely level. "Yeah," he said, "we both did." She looked at him for a moment that didn't need anything added to it. Then she picked up the IV stand and walked to the door and went back to room 3. Dax sat in the chair for a while after she left. He was not a man who talked to fill quiet. He sat in it and let it be what it was, which was the end of a very long night, and the uncertain beginning of whatever came after it. After a while, he said, "Graves is in county lockup. Vale and Slade are state custody pending formal charges. The lawyers in Denver have the SD card files as of 6 this morning. The Attorney General's office confirmed receipt before 7. Colt said Pruitt started talking before they got him through the intake door. Dax's voice carried no satisfaction, just a flat inventory of facts. He knew about Flynn Decker. They all knew about Decker. Colt was quiet. Flynn was thorough, Dax said. 71 transactions, 3 years. Every name that needed to be there is there. He looked at the window where the gray early light was beginning to make itself known at the edges of the dark. Commissioner Aldrich Moss is under investigation as of this morning. That's a name we didn't have 3 days ago. Colt said nothing. Dax reached into his vest pocket again and placed the iron crest patch on the bedside table beside the papers. Black felt, silver eagle. The stitching careful and precise, the thread bright even in the low hospital light. He set it there and did not explain it and did not look at Colt when he placed it. He simply stood in the way large men stand when they are done sitting all at once, and he put his hand on the door frame as he passed through it. He went down the hall to room 3. He sat in the chair beside his daughter's bed and looked at her face, which was the face it had always been, which was the face he had known since the morning she arrived in the world, and looked at him with the same clear-eyed directness she had directed at Slade in a dark building 2 hours after a crash that should have taken her off the board entirely. He looked at her and thought about all of it without saying any of it out loud because there was no one in the room who needed it said. She was asleep. He sat beside her and let her sleep. Outside, the morning came in across the Rockies the way it always came without regard for what the night had contained, the sky lightening from the east in a gradient from black to purple to the thin cold orange that appeared along the ridge line in the minutes before the sun cleared it. The snow had stopped. The parking lot of Briar Ridge Regional Hospital held its arrangement of motorcycles in the gathering light chrome and dark steel and the patient cold of engines that had been run hard all night and then left to rest. None of the riders had left. They stood or sat beside their bikes without complaint, without visible organization, without any announced intention regarding how long they planned to remain. Some had coffee from a drive-through run 2 riders had made. Some were talking quietly. Most were simply present in the way that presence becomes its own statement when it is sustained long enough by enough people. A night shift nurse came outside to get something from her car and stopped when she reached the door and looked at the lot. She stood for a long moment with her keys in her hand. Then she went back inside and said to the overnight charge nurse, who had also not yet gone home, "You need to see the parking lot." The charge nurse went to the window and looked. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Make sure rooms 3 and 4 have breakfast trays when the kitchen opens." In room 4, Colt Hadley was still looking at the ceiling. He had been looking at it since Earl left, and it gave him nothing in return, which was its purpose. The standard institutional tile pattern of a hospital room at 4 in the morning was specifically designed to present no content, and he was grateful for that now because it meant he could look at it while he thought without any interference from the visual field. He was thinking about what it would mean to take the papers. He had been offered things before in the 8 months since the Briar Ridge group home had become uninhabitable. He had been offered shelter beds with conditions attached, meal programs with required attendance at services he did not want, a job offer from a man outside a hardware store who had wanted something different from what he said he wanted. He had learned to read offers the way he read the road for what they actually were, rather than what they presented themselves as. He thought about what Dax had said. Not a transaction. He thought about the specific character of the three pieces of paper on the bedside table. A room, a lawyer, a social worker with no county connections. None of them required him to join anything or owe anything or become anything other than what he was. They were resources, not conditions. The difference between a hand reaching out to pull you in and a hand reaching out to steady you while you figured out your own footing. He thought about the patch. He picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. The felt was soft, and the silver thread of the eagle caught the thin gray light coming through the window, and he turned it over once and felt the raised precision of the stitching on the back with his thumb. He thought about what it meant, what Sawyer had told him it meant. The patch means you're not alone. He did not put it down. He held it and looked out the window at the parking lot where 500 bikes were arranged in the early light, and 500 people who had driven through a blizzard at 2 in the morning because a message had traveled down a chain were standing in the cold without being asked to explain themselves. He thought about chains, about the kind of chain you build not from obligation or strategy, but from the understanding that certain things require the specific weight of presence to exist at all. That certain things cannot be done alone, and that knowing this in advance before the night arrives, that requires it was the difference between having something to call on and having nothing. He had been alone for 8 months. He had been alone before that in most of the ways that mattered for longer than he had language to describe precisely. He put the patch in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his ribs, over the heart, where it pressed against him when the jacket zipped, where it would remain. The door opened. Sawyer came in without the IV this time, just the sling moving more carefully than she had an hour ago, because whatever adrenaline had been carrying her since mile marker 18 had finally completely run out. She sat in the chair and put her feet on the edge of the bed frame and looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "The papers." "Yeah. Are you going to take them?" He looked at the window, at the gray morning, at the bikes in the lot and the people standing beside them in the light that was coming slowly now, but coming. "I don't know what that looks like," he said, "taking something like that." "It looks like taking it," she said, "and then figuring out what comes after." He looked at her. "I've been figuring out what comes after for 8 months," he said, without any of it. "I know," she said. "That's why he put it on the table." A long silence moved through the room. Outside, a bird crossed the edge of the window, the first bird since before any of this began. It moved across the gray sky and disappeared over the roofline. Colt picked up the 3 folded pieces of paper. He held them. He did not unfold them. He just held them the way you hold something you have decided about, but are still in the first moments of the decision being real. He put them inside the same jacket pocket as the patch. Sawyer watched him do it. She did not say anything. She turned to look at the window and the growing light and the rows of bikes in the lot below and the people who had not gone home, and her face was tired in the way a face is tired after a very long night, but also clear in the way a face is clear after something important has been finished and finished correctly. The room was quiet. The hospital moved around them with its ordinary sounds, and outside the morning came in across the Rockies in the particular thin cold gold of a January dawn. And in the parking lot, 500 engines stayed silent and 500 people stayed where they were standing in the light that was finally arriving, not needing to be anywhere else, not going anywhere at all. Colt looked at Sawyer. She looked at him. "She kept moving," he said. "You kept moving," she said. The morning came in through the glass and the patch sat against his ribs, where it would press against him when the jacket zipped and the 3 pieces of paper sat beside it in the same pocket. And outside the parking lot held his arrangement of quiet steel, and the people who had come when the message went down the chain, and Dax Merritt sat in the chair beside his daughter's bed in room 3, with his hand resting on the blanket near her shoulder, and somewhere on a server in Northern Virginia, a voice memo file waited for the morning, and somewhere in Denver, a lawyer would open his laptop in 3 hours and find it, and somewhere in the Colorado Attorney General's office, a certified letter sat in a file that had been there for 6 weeks and would be opened today with new context and new weight. The night was over. What it had carried was safe. And in room 4 of Briar Ridge Regional Hospital, a 17-year-old boy who had spent 8 months being invisible to the systems that were supposed to see him, sat with a patch against his ribs and 3 pieces of paper in his pocket and looked out at the morning and understood that invisible was not the same as gone, and that the difference between those two things was in the end the difference between everything.